In this lesson we're going to cover React components. So before we go into the code, I've just brought up the documentation just to talk you through what a React component is. So components let you split the UI into independent reusable pieces. And that's one of the main benefits of using React, is that you can create smaller reusable bits of code that you can reuse across your project. So you can just think of a component as a JavaScript function. They accept an input, or they can accept an input, which are props or properties, and they return an output describing what should appear on the screen. So React has two types of components: function components and class components. So historically, function components were used for simpler components that did not need to maintain any state. We'll talk about state in a future lesson. And class components were for more complicated components where state was necessary. So since the introduction of React hooks, function components can now contain and manage state. So you'll see class components being used less and less. However, we will still cover class components briefly, just to give you an idea of what they are. If you are looking at some old React code, it's quite common to come across class components, but the majority of this course will be just writing function components. So let's go back to our sandbox and let's just create a function. So let's create a function called header. And you can notice that this is also a function, just in a slightly different syntax. If you have new to JavaScript, then don't worry, this is just exactly the same. They're both just functions. But if you do have some experience, you'll notice a slightly different way of writing a function here, just a shorter, abbreviated way. And notice I've called this header with a capital H. So React recognizes your components with this capital. So it's important that when writing your component, it needs to start with a capital letter and not in smaller case or capital or camel casing. React will get confused. You can notice the tags here are all in small case, so your components do need to be in capital. And then we can return something in this component, and we can maybe return this h1 here. So we have a function returning some JSX with our custom styles. And now we can actually use this component in our render method just by typing in header. And this is auto abbreviated some code. So opening and closing tags of header. And then you'll see that component and that KPI list now being returned on our screen. So this is simply how to use components in React. Now we don't actually need the opening and closing tag. We can just do a self-closing tag to make it a lot faster, because we're not actually writing any text or passing any text into our component. So typically you won't see multiple components stored in the same file. They'll be split out into separate files for easy maintainability of the code. So what I want to do now, what I'm going to do is create our first component, our second component, and I'm going to create an app.js file, which is just going to separate out this logic from our index.js. So I want to keep index.js very simple, and it's just going to render our app component, and our app component is going to contain our logic. So let's create a new file called app.jsx. I'm going to drag it into the src folder, and we want to grab this code. Great. So we need to create this function. So our function is called app. And we're going to want to export this. So once we fit out our logic in our app components, we're going to want to export this and then import it into index.js. So we can write the syntax export default app. And then I'm going to copy this back in. Okay, and we also don't need to be rendering anything. So as mentioned, our index.js is going to be rendering our app component. So our app.js, all it needs to do is return something. And it's going to return our JSX. So we can strip this out. And here is our app component. So in our function, we got our logic, some other internal functions, doing some stuff, and then we're returning our JSX. And then we're also exporting this function. And you notice now that React DOM has been highlighted, because now we're not actually using React DOM. We're not using the render method anymore in this component. So we can remove this. So back in our index.js file, we can remove all this logic. And we can also remove this. We also don't need styles.css, that's in our app components already. And what we want to do is use our app components in index.js. So let's import app from app. And then we can just render our app component here. Great, and then we can see our application is compiled with no issues. Notice I did not write .jsx. It will work if you write .jsx, but many of these in our React applications you can leave it off if that's in our config, and I'll show you that when we use create React app. But Code Sandbox is already that set up, so you don't need to write every time .jsx. It just assumes that this is a JSX file. Okay, so now we have our logic in our app components and we're rendering it in our index.js. And this is very typical of a React project and React best practice. So again, mentioning it again, but when we do set up our environment locally, you will see a lot of this boilerplate code already set up, and our app.jsx separate to our index.js. So now a challenge. So what I want you to do is create a new component called header, and I want you to move our header component into that file and import it into our app.jsx. So we need to remove this logic into a separate component called header. So why don't you pause the video now and have a go, and then when you restart I will show you how that is done. Okay, so I'm going to create a new file called header.jsx, and we know we're going to need React, and we can create the function of header. We want to export it, and we're just going to also want to return something here, and I can just grab that from app.jsx, and in app.jsx I'm just going to remove this function. Okay, so we do have a couple of issues. One, header is not defined, so we're going to have to actually import this. So let's import it. Import header from header. And we do have some more issues. So custom styles is not defined. So let's go to header.jsx. So we've now got this function in our app.jsx file, not in our header file. So we can copy this out and paste it in here. we're also going to need our Boolean. And that will render nicely. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too difficult. We've now moved the header logic into a separate file. Now what if you wanted to keep this Boolean in our app.jsx and not in our header.jsx? Well, let's see how that would work. And this is actually touching on using properties in React. So say we needed this Boolean variable in our app function. But what we can actually do is pass this to our header components using what is called a property or prop. Now let's create a prop, and I'm going to call this prop Boolean, just a slightly different naming convention to the variable itself. And we're going to pass in that bool. So we're going to pass in this value. So this is our property inside our braces, and we need curly braces, and then we're passing in the variable. And in header, we can return that or grab that value using props. So if I just pass in props there and then console log props, you can see now in our console we have got this Boolean property which equals true, and that is passed in as a JavaScript object. So now we can access that using props.boolean. So instead of this we can type props.boolean. So let's refresh this. And then we've got our application rendering nicely, and we've still got that in the console. Great, so this looks good. I'm going to remove this console log. And I've got another challenge for you. Let's do the same with our list component. So why don't you create a new component called list, but we need to keep data in our app components. So you'll be passing data to our list component as props. So why don't you pause the video now and have a go. Okay, so I hope you guys got on with that okay. I'm going to now create list.jsx, move it also into the src folder. We're going to need React because we'll be writing some JSX, and we can create our function called list, export default list, and we're going to want this logic here. So I'm going to cut this out, paste it with list, and we want to return our map. I'm going to put this in div tags because it does need to be enclosed in some JSX. So we've got our function, we're exporting it, and we need to import list from list. And we also need to pass our data. So I'm going to call it the same thing for now. So data property equals the variable data. And then in list we can receive that using props. And then we can access data in props.data.map. Okay, great. And now we've moved that logic from our app.js component into both our header and list components. So hopefully this is becoming a little bit clearer in your mind how we can separate out our logic into smaller reusable pieces of code. Just one last thing I want to show you, and we will do some work on object destructuring in the next section. But just as a little preview, instead of just passing props here, we can actually access our data property by using curly braces and typing in data. And then we don't need this props anymore, and everything will still work as expected. So what we're actually doing, we know that data is is in our props object. So we're actually destructuring that and just grabbing the data object rather than accessing through props. So I will cover some object destructuring, as I said, in the next section, but just good as a little preview, you can see how that works here. And this is really just to make our syntax a little bit cleaner and just to reduce the amount of code that we're actually writing. So that's it for this lesson and this section. In the next section, we're going to be starting our first project. We're going to be using props, states, and building a small application using click hypercubes to actually cycle through the value of a hypercube. So it's just to get you familiar with some more introductory React topics, and also to get you used to using the hypercube object, which will come in handy in future sections. So it should be fun, and we'll continue in the next section.